Yeah.
Click. You can just you can either use the mouse,
Yeah.
Either or.
Okay.
And you can move this around. So if there's something on the screen that this is getting
Yeah.
in the way.
Okay. Great. Okay. Yeah. So hi again, everyone. So that's the title of our talk: LGBTQ plus refugees distrust the refugee status determination system. LGBTIQ, lesbian, gay, bi, trans, intersex, queer, plus something else. So as a bit of background to this paper, this is a joint paper, quite obviously by Patty and I. To be perfectly honest, it's not yet a paper, but we hope that it will be a paper. This is a first shot in presenting this, so we're very interested to hear what you actually what you have to say about this, whether there's something going on here. We started thinking about these issues a few months ago with Patty. The background being that I've been working on a series of papers and now on a book manuscript on LGBTIQ refugee admission and integration issues. So that's kind of what I do. I haven't really worked on trust, but I really want to work on trust. And Patty also has an interest in LGBTIQ refugee issues, and she has obviously worked on trust a lot. So we thought that it would be a good way of joining forces and try to put up our individual strengths and maybe sort of get rid of some of the individual weaknesses and along the way. So what the paper is about, what we try to do in the paper is roughly this. We try to analyze what kinds of elements of trust and distrust, possibly mistrust, are incorporated in the refugee status determination system, how they operate there, and how some types of trust and mistrust might actually be important inherent elements of the system, and then some elements of mistrust and distrust might not be such inherent elements in the system, or at least they shouldn't be working in the system. We also then identify certain specific difficulties that LGBTIQ plus claimants might encounter in terms of trust, mistrust, and distrust in the system. And having identified these specific difficulties, we then try to propose some institutional solutions. Solutions maybe being a too strong a word. We try to propose some ways forward how to fix or alleviate some of these difficulties and problems that LGBTIQ claimants in the system might encounter. And how we go on doing this, we are actually going to go a bit back and forth. We see how it goes. So Patty will be starting by an overview of the refugee status determination system and some of the concepts that we are using, how we use trust and mistrust and distrust and discretion in our talk. I will then talk a little bit about the special challenges relating to LGBTIQ claimants. Patty will then do further diagnosis of where these challenges in terms of trust and distrust might be coming from, and then I'm going to say something about possible solutions or ways forward. So, Patty.
Hi, I guess somebody will tell me if you can't hear me at some point. So, but I think we're good. So my first job here is just to give you some of the sort of the conceptual framework that we're using. As Anna-Mari said, I have worked on trust for a long time. So these are my definitions, and I will just say before you object to the way that we have defined these terms, to say that that's okay. The point is to try to give you sort of a conceptual space to understand how the refugee status determination system relates to questions of trust. or how the relationship between, in particular, the officer and the claimant, how we should think about that relationship. So here's just some definitions. Trust is an attitude. This is the Bayer definition that Hale referenced earlier in her talk. Trust is an attitude towards others that demonstrates a willingness to put oneself in a position of vulnerability with respect to their hoped for goodwill. There's a lot of discussion about what would count as the opposites of that. Here are two things that might be sort of opposites. One is mistrust. If you don't like the word of mistrust, you can just call it skepticism, but this is a sort of we use the term mistrust to refer to a skeptical or suspicious attitude towards others, and distrust as a hardened attitude that motivates effectively the refusal to trust others, or in Hale's language, a refusal to put oneself in a position of vulnerability, lest that misplaced trust be betrayed or disappointed in some way. So notice that you can trust people, you can trust people and distrust or mistrust people at the same time. You could trust your doctor to give medical advice, but not their political opinions. So that's an example. We'll come back to this, but you can trust people in virtue of the roles that they possess, and you can trust that they will carry out those roles well while not trusting them in other spaces. This particular thing will come back in a moment, or when I'm speaking for the second time. Discretion. So trust is at the heart of discretion. In trusting others, we are giving them discretion to use their freedom optimistically in a trustworthy way, but it has to be used well. That is to say, you want when you give people the discretion to act, you hope that they respond to the goodwill, they respond to the trust, they reward the trust, and so on. And there's some complexities which I will talk about shortly. Again, next time I speak about how we would assess that. Can I switch slides here from here? I have no idea, actually. Okay, yes, look at that. Or maybe I didn't do that. I don't know. Maybe Anna Marie did that. Okay, anyway, so like the refugee status determination system. So I assume that most of you have thought about what this looks like, but basically what it looks like is there's a claimant and an officer in a room, and the officer has to use their discretion to identify whether somebody is entitled to refugee status. But not all claimants in that room are entitled to refugee status. At least that's the premise of this relationship, which is that the job is to assess, is somebody entitled to refugee status? And the implication of that is that the officer is taking a mistrustful attitude towards the applicant, right? So they're sort of they're open to the possibility that that person is entitled to refugee status, but their job is to try to probe the story, make sure it's true, make sure that persecution is real, make sure that the violence that they're trying to flee is real, and so on. So there's an element of mistrust that is central to this this relationship, and so a lot of whether or not this relationship is going to be successful at determining whether somebody is a refugee has to do with how the applicant, sorry, that's a typo, it's not application, how the applicant responds. So I will talk again about that in my next section, but that's just the sort of the introductory comments, and then I will pass it back over to Anna Marie.
Okay, so now we have the general sort of framework in place, some of the concepts that we are using. What I'm going to be talking next is why the refugee status determination process might be especially challenging for LGBTIQ plus claimants, and try to connect this to the ways in which decisions for the asylum of LGBTIQ refugees typically come about. So in order to see why this might be especially challenging from the perspective of trust and mistrust, we might want to look at some of the typical bases for rejecting sexual orientation and gender identity-based claims in the system. And obviously, our purpose here is not to say that whenever there's a claim based on sexual orientation and gender identity, they should always be accepted. There's always something going wrong if they are rejected. Of course, some claims might not be such that they should be accepted, but there is something happening in the system that might tell us about the specific difficulties of LGBTIQ claimants in terms of trust when we look at how the rejections for sexual orientation, gender identity-based claims typically how they typically look like. So there's typically two ways, two avenues, or two grounds why sexual orientation and gender identity-based claims are being rejected. The first is that the claimant is not able to demonstrate that they have a well-founded fear of persecution owing to their membership in a specific social group, namely LGBTIQ+. And the second ground is then that we might be able to prove that LGBTIQ persons are persecuted in the country of origin of the claimant, but it might be that the claimant is not able to demonstrate that they actually are LGBTIQ. And if you are not LGBTIQ, then you can't be persecuted because of your sexual orientation or gender identity. It's not quite as simple as that, because sometimes you might be perceived to be queer, even if you are not queer, and you might be persecuted. But typically, we think that in order to be persecuted based on sexual orientation and gender identity, you do have to be LGBTIQ+, and you also have to demonstrate that. How do these two bases for rejecting sexual orientation and gender identity-based claims come about? There are certain contributing factors to this. So the first one has to do with so-called discretion or concealment. The fact that many LGBTIQ persons who are persecuted, they do try to conceal their identities for obvious reasons. They don't go around waving the flag of, hey, I'm queer, if the danger is that you are going to be put into prison or tortured or whatever it might be the case. And still, this idea of concealment or discretion is something that has been talked quite a lot in the literature on LGBTIQ asylum claims. Still sort of 10, 15 years ago, many countries who were already accepting sexual orientation and gender identity-based claims, they were basically saying that, well, if a person has been able to be discreet or conceal their identity in their country of origin, that has protected them from persecution. So they can't have a well-founded fear of persecution in that case, because nobody knows they are queer. That kind of reasoning has changed in the last 10 years or so. It's nowadays no longer expected that, well, if a person can conceal their identity, they can't have a well-founded fear of persecution. But as we'll come back to a little bit later, the idea of discretion and concealment, it does still play a role, and it plays a negative role in many of the sexual orientation and gender identity-based claims. So the idea of discretion and concealment, it plays an important part in the idea that, well, you can't prove that you have been persecuted or that you have well-founded fear of persecution. It also plays a part in the assessment of whether the person is actually LGBTIQ. If you don't tell anyone, well, are you then LGBTIQ? And how do you prove that you are LGBTIQ? What do? Do you film yourself having sex with a partner of the same gender and then submit this self-made pornographic material? I mean, and it might be that you don't even have had a chance of so-called acting out your sexuality in the circumstances that you are faced with. And the idea of concealment, it also plays a role when the LGBTIQ people are making their claims. So in many cases, when a queer person comes to make their claim, they don't disclose their sexuality straight away for obvious reasons. It's better not to tell everyone that you are queer. So there are questions about late disclosure, so that you have been in the refugee system for a while, you haven't told that you are queer to start with, you only tell after some months, and that is often considered to be a sign that you are not a genuine applicant. If you were a genuine applicant, you should have come in and told us straight away. And the second contributing factor to these two ways of rejecting claims has to do with certain kinds of Western stereotypes. So many LGBTIQ persons who are persecuted, who for very good reasons are concealing their identity, might not be the kind of stereotypical flamboyant, flag-waving gay person going around in the streets telling everyone that, hey, I'm queer and it's so cool. And in many cases, if a person passes as straight, then the officials are not necessarily believing them being queer. Now, what we find interesting with the discretion and also these Western stereotypes is that these are something that come into the system from the ways in which queer people are presenting themselves in the system, so that their own behavior sort of feeds into some of the reasons why the officials are being suspicious about their claims. And we are talking in the paper, we are talking about this in terms of what we term logic of concealment, which is it's a near universal experience of LGBTIQ+ people who acknowledge that indeed there are some occasions where it's safer not to tell people that you're queer. This is near universal. Of course, some people might not experience this very often. Refugees who are persecuted based on their sexual orientation and gender identity experience this all the time. It's just not safe to tell people that one is queer. And in the refugee system, this is something that is also reinforced within the system. It's especially problematic for LGBTIQ refugees. And in the paper, we are try to unpack this a little bit with the queer theoretical concept of the epistemology of the closet, which basically refers to the kind of double bind that you have as a queer person. So if you're a refugee and you conceal your identity, say in your country of origin, on refugee routes, on refugee camps, in the situation where you are being interviewed and so on, you are somehow protecting yourself of the reactions, hatred, homophobia, discrimination, violence, and so on and so forth. But that concealment is having negative effects on your RSD process. On the other hand, if you are open about your sexuality, you do risk being reacted to in a negative way by, for example, fellow refugees, fellow countrymen, perhaps the RSD officials. But on the other hand, that might, and that's important, that might help you in the RSD system. So the refugees who are LGBTIQ, they find themselves being in this balancing between whether they appreciate the immediate sort of safety in the situation where they are at the moment, more than the sort of long-term effects in the RSD system. And apparently I have been using loads of time, so let's carry on.
Okay, well, that's good. You set me up well. I don't know what that means for how long I should talk. So I'll try to go for 3 minutes here just to explain this slide. So this slide is intended to pull in the analysis that Anna-Mari has done into the language of trust that I introduced on my earlier slides. So there's sort of two issues here. One is that the logic of concealment, which Anna-Mari has just described, makes the assessment of LGBT claimant more difficult from a trust perspective, right? So you're looking at this relationship. There's an officer and a claimant, and the claimant has been formed by the knowledge that it is often safer to keep who they are to themselves, and that feels safe, can reasonably and does, and there's lots of evidence for this in the literature that people feel safer in this space to avoid revealing the full extent of their identity and experience as a queer person. And on the other hand, I described earlier that the relationship itself is a mistrustful one with an officer whose job it is to engage in a mistrustful way towards claimants, with the job of assessing who is a real and who is not, or who is really entitled to refugee status and who is not, right? So you can see the complication. There's individuals who are anxious about revealing their identities. They're mistrusting because they have a history of being exposed to danger every time they reveal their identities, and an officer whose job it is to get people to reveal those identities and explain the basis of their persecution, right? So that's one challenge here, is that that it is an inherently mistrustful relationship in both directions. And the second problem relates to the way in which I described trust earlier, that you can trust a person to do some set of tasks, but not another set of tasks. So the example that I gave when I was last speaking was of a doctor, that you could trust a doctor to give you medical advice, but maybe not to tell you who to vote for. You might not even believe that that doctor is a good parent to their children, right? So maybe you wouldn't want that doctor as a babysitter. I don't know why you would ask your doctor for that service, but you can see that people can have these multiple roles. You can have multiple trust or mistrusting relations with people. So in the case of this relationship between the officer and a claimant, one thing that you should know, if this is not something you're already familiar with, is that the refugee status determination system typically happens in a country that is next to, and therefore culturally similar to, the country which has engaged in the persecution from which the claimant has fled. And so you've got a claimant in many, many cases. You've got a claimant who's making a claim, and that the officer is going to be a local person, a person who is from a culturally similar environment. And so there's an additional complication, which is that that claimant might be willing to trust the UNHCR or the refugee status determination system, the role that the officer has. So might be willing to trust somebody in a particular role, but on the other hand, and at the exact same time, mistrust them as a member of a shared ethnic or religious or cultural group. And so you've got claimants who are in the situation trying to assess whether the officer is either is going to respond to them as a fellow co-ethnic, in which case in a homophobic and transphobic manner, or as a representative of either the UNHCR or what the refugee status determining organization. And that we use the language of institutional bleeding, which is to say that that the officer should be able to do their role, even though they're a member of an ethnic community that might have transphobic or homophobic views. And at the same time, the claimant is not going to be sure about whether or not that person can engage only their role and leave aside the sort of the cultural perspectives of the community that they're a part of. We call that institutional bleeding. And the dangers of institutional bleeding, just to return to the concept of discretion, is precisely a problem of the discretion given to officers. So officers are charged with assessing whether people are entitled to refugee status. They're given the discretion to do that, and they can use it well or poorly. If you have a question, we have a sort of a conception of what counts as well or poorly, which we can answer in the questions if you want more information. But the general sort of diagnosis is that the giving of discretion to officers who might be a representative of the institution or might be a representative of a cultural or ethnic community with homophobic views is the source of the difficulty for claimants in this process. Anna-Mari, bring it home.
So I'm presuming that I have -2 minutes, but I'm just going to pretend I didn't hear that minus. So I'm going to use 2 minutes for the solutions. What are solutions to this difficulty of institutional bleeding that Patty just described? Well, we want to stop the bleeding. And by stopping the bleeding, we want to reduce the need of LGBTIQ refugees to conceal their identities in this particular refugee status determination process. And how do we stop the bleeding? Well, one is that we want to constrain the discretion offered to the officials. And how we might do that is by developing sexual orientation and gender identity guidelines into the processes. I mean, this work is already being done and ongoing. The solutions that we provide are nothing new. What is new is sort of why we are giving these solutions, what they are trying to fix, which is the institutional bleeding. So child-based guidelines, which are more based on the kinds of objective evidence that one can give for by reducing discretion, it will increase the predictability of the system and hopefully as long as the LGBTIQ claimants are aware that there is constrained discretion, it might also strengthen their view of the officials in their role as institutional actors, so they can trust them as institutional actors rather than thinking of them primarily as their fellow countrymen who might be extremely queerphobic. We do nevertheless know that there are certain difficulties into this idea of constraining discretion. We don't want to be eliminating discretion. We don't think that whatever guidelines you have, if you literally follow them, then we are going to get to the correct results. That would be a strange thought indeed. So apart from constraining discretion, we do also think that the kind of LGBTIQ plus cultural sensitivity training to all people working in the refugee system is important, because it is increasing the knowledge on LGBTIQ issues, the kinds of persecution and disadvantages that they are facing, how they might be reacting, why that is the basis for protection. So it might be reducing queerphobia. It is also directing the discretion, the remaining discretion, to right direction, so that the officials are not basing their assessment on their queerphobic views, but rather on proper knowledge of LGBTIQ issues. And we also think that having this kind of cultural sensitivity training, especially if it's done together with some of the local actors who are aware of the local circumstances and how local LGBTIQ people are being in their situation, then it might also operate as a certain kind of corrective mechanism to the already existing guidelines, because the already existing guidelines, there are quite a lot of difficulties in those as well. For example, they tend to be fairly Western centric, and there's Western stereotypes being involved in the guidelines. So there's a better sensitivity to the vast variety of ways of being queer and of being persecuted or being disadvantaged by virtue of being queer. That's it. Sorry, we probably went a bit over time.
Thank you, Anna Marie and Patty. We'll take questions now. Anyone has any? Okay.
Thanks, Patty and Anna Marie. Really fascinating and interesting puzzle to be thinking about, and very important as well. And I apologize, this isn't an analytically rich question. This is more, I'm just really curious about these sexuality and gender identity guidelines and objective evidence and what that might mean, because talking about constraining discretion, that's sort of half the problem. The other problem is that the evidentiary base, might not exist. I mean, as you were talking, I was immediately thinking of a friend of mine who was immigrating to Canada, and I had to write a letter testifying to, that I knew he had an long-term intimate relationship with the woman he was with, but that was all very public. He wasn't hiding anything. And I know there were pictures and other kind of evidence that were submitted. So, if you're concealing your existence, maybe not even being able to kind of behaviorally manifest this part of your identity, I mean, what does objective evidence even look like? I'm just really curious about that. But thank you for a really interesting talk.
Okay, so I guess in some cases it might be the case that there is no objective evidence that you can produce. It's your story that is being assessed, whether that's credible. And of course, in some cases, it might also be that there's a lot of internalized homo and transphobia in the claimant themselves. I've heard of cases where claimants comes and they know that they can apply for asylum based on their sexual orientation, and they say that, well, can you give me asylum based on my sexual orientation, and can you then fix me from this horrible disease that I actually have? I mean, it's hugely problematic on how what kind of evidence can be produced and what not. I think Patty probably has some anecdotes about the kinds of evidence that is currently being used.
Sorry, I mean, sorry. Anecdotes. I could probably tell you a million anecdotes, but what I would just say is that the guidelines are effectively a request to be flexible and generally to adopt an attitude of trust. Right. The sort of the guidelines start with, look, LGBTQ claimants face this. They don't use the language of the logic of concealment, but they face all kinds of reasons why they won't have identified who they are or what they are, and in fact that it's highly likely to be made even more complicated when they're in intersectional cases, people where SOGI claimants are also ethnic minorities or religious minorities and so on, so that the guidelines sort of try to shape the orientation that officers will take to somebody who's making this claim. And instructs them effectively to take their story at face value. What kinds of objective evidence? In most of the cases that I'm involved in, the objective evidence comes in the form of an outside source. So it's just like Anna-Mari described, it's just like the questioner. Sorry, I don't know your name. Said, which is like when I work with claimants who are abroad, I'm asked to say that to the best of my knowledge, this person really is entitled to protection on the basis of SOGI considerations. And so often outsiders, people who are in safe spaces like me, can provide the kind of, as it were, objective evidence.
This is dangerous business here. Yeah.
Hi, thanks, Anna-Mari and Patty. Patty, it's sad that you're not here, but I won't make you feel bad about it. Really important paper. I think it's an incredibly important issue. I just want to ask a sort of philosopher's question about the relationship between trust and discretion. So, especially if you're relying on buyers' view of trust, trust involves giving discretionary power over to others. So what that special vulnerability that she says is associated with trust, it exists because of that, because you're granting others discretion. So that would suggest that if you're constraining discretion, you're actually limiting trust. You're not increasing it. I think there's a way around that problem, but I wonder what you think about that.
Hi, Carolyn. I agree that it's sad that I'm not there. And I just want to tell you that my oldest kid graduated from grade 6 yesterday, and there's parties all week. So that is why I'm here, to be horrifyingly embarrassing at all of these parties to my child. I mean, you don't want to miss that opportunity. So yeah, right. So, okay. So this is good. This is a really helpful question. I will see what, Anna-Mari thinks, but yes, so it would suggest that you're constraining, by constraining discretion, you're also constraining trust. But by constraining discretion, the flip side is also true. You're also constraining opportunities for mistrust or distrust to arise, and that's what we're trying to do, right? So I guess that your question implies that we need to take a more sophisticated assessment here, but like the whole problem is that these claimants, these officers are, and this is the literature that Anna-Mari talked about, but they're asking bonkers questions, like bananas questions, like, what is your favorite sexual position? And what specifically about girls do you find attractive? Like, is it their breasts or their ass, right? So they're asking like things that just make no sense. Or are you familiar with the bars, the gay bars in Nairobi or whatever, depending on where people, if people are located in Kenya. So on the one hand, in this particular instance, it looks like actually constraining discretion will be a trust builder. Because we're constraining officers from being able to ask questions that undermine trust. But I take the philosopher's question that we need to be more sophisticated in that analysis.
So can I? Well, I'll also so I agree with what Patty was saying there. I think that it's also interesting. Like when we are talking about constraining discretion, I think we are thinking of it in terms of a short-term solution to now existing problem. and sort of constraining discretion, it might be sort of reducing trust. But you have to remember that in the situation you have two roles that the officer is playing. So what we are trying to make is strengthen the role of the officer as the officer that the claimant is typically trustful of, and then weaken the role of the fellow countryman that they would be typically distrustful of. So in maybe that.
So the last question was a philosopher's question. This is an empiricist question, barefoot empiricism. Is there any data on the probability of a claim made on this basis being accepted compared to the probability of other refugee claims not based on this kind of, on a sort of sexual or gender orientation? So like, is this a total disaster area in which no one's getting through the screen as opposed to other areas? Is it an area where significant numbers of claims are being made and comparable levels of admission are emerging? So what do the numbers tell you?
So there are some numbers, not particularly much, and depending on countries, some are making statistics about socially placed claims, and some are not. There's no sort of comprehensive data. It's not a complete and utter disaster area that people wouldn't get refugee status based on sexual orientation and gender identity. It does also depend a lot on what letter you are. So, for example, lesbians, especially Black lesbians, have a far lower statistic probability of getting asylum claim accepted than gay men. In many cases, Black lesbians who often live in a standard cis heteronormative relationship and have children and so on and so forth, that is considered to be something that shows that, well, actually they are not lesbians and so on. So it also depends on the letter that you are. But I'm not aware of sort of overarching statistics of lumping all the sexual orientation and gender identity based claims and seeing what's the percentage and then all the other claims on the other side. In some cases, it's actually, in some contexts, it's easier to get refugee status and asylum based on sexual orientation and gender identity than it would be otherwise.
So unless you were going to respond, Patty, I was just handed this microphone. Okay. So anyway, thanks for the paper. I really enjoyed it. Thought it was, learned a lot. And this is neither an empiricist question nor a philosophical question. I was just a little surprised at the last move where you wanted to reduce discretion, maybe partly for the reason that Carolyn identified. But I thought that you might have thought of like a number of solutions. Like, so for example, if one of the problems is that the officer doing the determination is from a similar ethnic or cultural group, it seemed to me that you might want to ask the claimant, who would you like to determine your case? Would you like a fellow X local person, or would you like a complete stranger, maybe not even local, maybe not from the same cultural group, to determine it? Like, put it in the hands of the claimant. I mean, I don't know if empirically if that would make a difference, but since that was one of the sources of the problem, it seemed that maybe they should have some autonomy to make that decision. Anyway, that was a thought. I just thought that might have been one of your solutions or one of your suggestions at the end, and maybe there are others.
So I guess that might become one of the things that we discuss in the paper as a possible solution. So thanks for that. I guess part of the problem, not the whole problem, but part of the problem is resource question. How many people do we actually have, and what kinds of context we are doing these assessments? Also, when we think about the process, the interviewing process is not only the official, there's also the interpreters or language interpreters who tend to necessarily be from the same cultural context and so on. Do you want to add something, Betty?
Yeah, I mean, I like that idea. I guess the question is for Anna Marie and I is whether we want the conclusion to this to be a list of institutional possibilities that could be undertaken, or within the confines of what is already being done. All right. So I think both Anna Marie and I had thought of ourselves as doing like a very small thing, but I guess one question that we can ask ourselves is whether or not we want to sort of consider a wider range of options with respect to solutions to try to signal that there are multiple ways to solve the problem. And just to Keith's question, like I mean, I don't know where we are in time or anything. It's a slightly different, slightly hard to assess the situation, but like I kind of wanted to know what you think the numbers would tell us if we were able to give them to you precisely. But like in general, we know several things about this situation. One is, as Anna Marie said, that Black lesbians, especially Black lesbians with children, are very are comparatively quite likely to have their claim dismissed, whereas gay men are comparatively quite high. So one sort of attempt inside of this work is just to try to make the playing field sort of even for all people who are claiming SOGI as the reason for their entitlement. But the other is that it varies. I mean, these numbers, acceptance rates varies extraordinarily by country, which is to say, Hungary's assessment procedures never accept SOGI-based claims, and Canada's overwhelmingly accepts SOGI-based claims. So there's a lot of country differentials precisely because some countries are more open or tolerant or accepting of this as a claim across the wide range of presentations of SOGI people. So like I think we're happy to look more into detail at the numbers and to include them in the paper, but I wouldn't mind, you can put it in the chat. Or you could tell Anna Marie later, like what would be usefully illuminated if we had these numbers from the perspective of the argument that we're trying to make.
Just before any more questions, we only have 2 minutes left. So if we could maybe keep them brief, and then maybe we'll do them back to back and you guys can answer after.
Okay, so yeah, hi, Jolt here. So I wanted to ask very quickly about something that, so at the beginning you mentioned that the whole relationship between the officer and the claimant is kind of based on mistrust because the officer is kind of probing if the story is true, but then you also mentioned in explaining what its guidelines are, that part of the guidelines is to take the story at face value, right? So I'm wondering, is that because LGBTQ plus claimants are particularly vulnerable, or because of there's this logic of concealment, or because generally the premise of the relationship shouldn't be that of mistrust, that these officers shouldn't act like insurance people trying to get out of paying anyone, but rather they should act like doctors, right? If you go to the doctor, they don't treat you with mistrust. If you tell it hurts somewhere, they take that at face value. And should that be the model for these officers? And is that the larger conclusion that maybe you're adding at, or is it that LGBTQ plus claimants are special?
Yeah, thank you. That was a great presentation. And actually this worked out great because my question is really close to yours. I want to say I really appreciate you highlighting mistrust as sort of like a generator of this kind of distrustful relationship. And like you, I was wondering whether maybe the issue is that it's not a position of mistrust, but actually of distrust, like whether it goes from suspicion to active distrust, maybe that's the issue, or maybe that the issue is mistrust itself, that it begins from a position of mistrust. And then the person on the other end of the table has to sort of prove themselves to be trustworthy. So they have to go from a place of mistrust to trust, or a place of distrust to trust, which is obviously exceedingly difficult. So I wondered if you could speak more to that. But yeah, thank you.
Do you want to go, Betsy?
I'm sure. Okay, those are great questions, and mostly I just want to say thank you for the questions. So the second question, I'm so sorry. Was that Hale who asked that question? Anyway, thank you for that question. I actually think that's really helpful, right? So what we should be thinking about, Anna Mari, now talking to you, is what are the conditions under which this sort of inherently mistrustful relationship can be brought to a trusting one? I mean, so I think that's a really important insight, which actually I had not thought of. So I appreciate that. Chances are very high that Anna Mari had already thought about that because she's ahead of me on this. So I will just say thank you for that. And Jolt, yeah, right. So I think Anna Marie and I might be in a different place on this. I think LGBTQ claimants are special. They're special for, they're not the only special group, but they're highly vulnerable in their countries of refuge, which distinguishes them from many other refugees who are simply vulnerable, not highly vulnerable in their countries of refuge. And so, yes, I think the premise should be one of truth, that claimants are telling the truth in this particular instance, because the danger to them of admitting their identities if it weren't true, like it's not that nobody would ever do that, but like in the kinds of conditions that people are making SOGI-based claims, it's extraordinarily dangerous to be a member of the SOGI population. So you wouldn't just be like, kind of fake it. Some people do. We know that that's true, but it's not a thing that people would ordinarily do. There's not a huge moral hazard here, which is to say there's not a huge moral hazard in sort of just accepting that when somebody says they're LGBTQ, and then we say, that sounds reasonable to us.
Thank you, Patty and Anna Marie. Thank you for your questions. The next presentation we have is Kirsten Reibold, Trust, National Community, and Immigration.
Okay. So my paper is also not yet a paper, so I would really appreciate comments and questions that help me see whether it can go in this direction or maybe in a different direction. And what I want to talk about, sorry. How do I? Yes. Sorry, I'm just trying. Okay. So the thesis that I want to talk about is that current theories of integration overemphasize the need for integration by assuming that there is a significant difference between immigrants that are coming into a country and the host society that we need to bridge, and also at the same time by differentiating too little about different contexts of trust and how that plays into integration and successful integration. So I'll have a little bit more about the first part and a little bit less about the second part, but what I'm really interested in getting feedback on is actually the second part, I think. Yes? Or is it the microphone maybe? Yes. Wait. Is it better like this? Like this? Should I just hold it like this? Is that better? Okay. Less hand waving from my side. Okay, super. Some lights to move. Okay, so let's start. So let me start with the first point, overemphasizing difference. So I think political theorists, no matter whether they are liberal nationalists or more conservative or multiculturalists, often take as their starting point that there is significant cultural differences that need to be bridged in the context of education, and so that is just what we kind of assume. And then so there is the idea that there is a certain national identity and national culture that the host society possesses, and from which the culture and the identity of immigrants differs. And so as David Miller very aptly titles his book, they are sense strangers in our midst. And the goal of integration is to not make them strangers anymore. So then the philosophical discussion then centers around who needs to change. So is it a two-way process, or is there more a burden on immigrants, and what needs to change? So do we have more civic conception? Is it about integration as adopting certain liberal democratic values, or is there a thicker conception where it's about also more cultural integration in the sense of certain cultural values and activities, for example? But the idea is that we have two things that are different that somehow have to come closer together. So there is no doubt cultural differences as well as national identity. So I do not mean to say that these things do not exist. But what I would like to question is how we as political theorists should relate to that and contribute also to the construction of these. So I've put up here books that probably most of you know by people who fall into the social constructivist tradition, and who have argued for a long time that national identities or nationalism itself is a construct that lives from imagined shared histories or shared fates, imagined shared fates. And so that these national identities and cultures are constructed does not make them less real, but I think it allows us to be or to highlight two things. So the first is that it reminds us that these identities are constructed and that our descriptions of immigrants and receiving societies are, and their differences, are contributing to these constructions. So it matters how we talk about these things. And it contributes to how we understand ourselves as nations and communities. William Schinkel describes quite convincingly how the integration discourse in Europe is used to construct and strengthen a very specific European identity as something modern, enlightened, and forward, in contrast to the assumedly other migrants that are not so. The second thing I think having this in mind allows us to do is to question the picture of stability and homogeneity that national identity often presents to us. So theorists like Edward Said, but also Homi Bhabha have highlighted and emphasized that histories of imperialism and colonialism, but also ongoing globalization, have made borders more porous and identities more hybrid, so that even though we might have in our minds so that they are national identities and we might feel attached to them, they are not as homogeneous as we might want to assume. And so here I also want to quote Said, I think, who's, I'm not sure whether I can remove this or how. Well, but the important parts are the first ones anyways. So he says, imperialism consolidated the mixture of cultures and identities on a global scale. But its worst and most paradoxical gift was to allow people to believe that they were only, mainly, exclusively white or black or Western or Oriental. Yet just as human beings make their own history, they also make their cultures and ethnic identities. And this is kind of what I've talked about now. And so the next thing is what I want to talk about next. No one can deny the persisting continuities of long traditions, sustained habitations, national languages, and cultural geographies. But there seems no reason except fear and prejudice to keep insisting on their separation and distinctiveness, as if that was all human life was about. Survival, in fact, is about the connections between things. In Eliot's phrase, reality cannot be deprived of the other echoes that inhabit the garden. So I'll stop here. But I think what I would like to take from that quote, and also for the rest of the talk, is this idea that there are national identities that are up to a certain point distinct, but there are also influences and shared commonalities through history and through movement in history that we often start overlooking, and that we as political theorists maybe even contribute when we talk about integration as having to bridge these differences, instead of maybe painting an alternative picture of immigrants and receiving societies, which could be a little bit more nuanced and that allows both differences, nuances within each group, but also that allows to see exactly these connections and similarities between groups. That doesn't make them completely the same, but that gets them closer together in a certain sense. It doesn't make it strangers in our midst anymore. And I think such a view might not just be more realistic, but it might also help us to think more clearly about what kind of integration is required to build the trust that we need for a society to function well. Let's see. Oh, sorry. Taking that out. So, and here I would like to start talking about the second part of the argument, namely that we should pay more attention to contexts of trust in integration. And so this is a picture we're saying, well, it's very far up, but basically we shouldn't focus on what is in the circle, right, where we see a huge difference. But if we look at the nuances and put them better together, then we might start seeing where the connections are. There's more similarities than we have. And so trust and context. So to start, many social scientists, and I think most of the talks we had today, they focus on general trust, and I think that is with good reason. So they usually are interested in asking the question, does one think that one can trust an unknown person? So are unknown people that one encounters generally trustworthy? But I think we often overlook that trust is contextual. So we might trust people in one context, but not in the other. And I think Patty has already kind of aptly described it, and she said, well, I might trust my doctor as a doctor, but not as a parent or as a chin or something like that, right? So we judge whether we can trust people based on their competence, on their skills, on the values they have, on the assumed motivations, goodwill, etc. And so in different situations, I have different assessments of people. So for example, I might trust someone as my neighbor, but not as my doctor or as my politician. So now if we look at integration and what we often think of as markers of successful integration, we see that there are very different contexts in which trust is needed. So, and accordingly, there are different things that might become relevant when we decide whether to trust people and whether to cooperate with them in these different contexts. So one way of looking at that is that integration is often understood as immigrants, or when integration is successful, immigrants are fully and equally participating in the social and political life of the country that they have moved to. Right, and such full participation covers different arenas. So it covers work, education, political participation, relations in neighborhoods, friendships, etc. Now, for all of these, some traits and values that make people trustworthy are the same. So, for example, honesty, I think, is something that I value no matter whether I ask myself, should I trust this person as a friend or as a politician or as an employee, right? But then there are also other traits and motivations which might decide whether I find someone trustworthy that differ through these arenas. So, for example, trusting someone who rents an apartment might depend on how one judges their ability and willingness to pay rent. So here also kind of competence in a certain sense comes in, material background conditions, their assumed respect for others' property, what we think about how clean and maybe quiet they are. But whether one trusts someone as a co-worker or as employee might not so much have something to do with whether someone is able to pay the rent or whether they are especially clean at home. Here we might ask about cooperativeness, reliability, willingness to work hard, etc. But both of these things, right, being able to find a home on the rental market, having equal opportunities to be employed, these are both markers of integration in a certain sense. That's what makes someone well integrated, to have equal opportunities in these different arenas. But when people decide whether they kind of trust someone, whether they give them a chance, they look at different things. And equally, whether, for example, someone has democratic values might not figure at all in a lot of these things. We might not care about whether a co-worker or a babysitter has democratic values. We care about other things. But when we think about whether to give someone democratic citizenship, for example, we might very much care about their democratic values. So let me see. Yes. So which values and identities? So these are different contexts or different markers of integration where I think, and there are lots of more, where we can see that these are different contexts where we need whether to trust people based on slightly different markers. So there is some overlap, but it's not just covered by generalized trust, and it's not covered by the same kind of items in a certain way. And so which values and identities should be shared for integration to be successful then depends on which aspect of integration we focus on, and which effect of immigration and diversity we are worried about, right? So in the literature, what is often discussed is the so-called liberal dilemma, where people are very worried about the effect of increasing diversity on social cohesion and support for the welfare state. So, but this is something that different from equal access to the labor market or having friendships in one's neighborhood and being socially integrated. So I think I don't know doing this right. Okay. So I think what we should do is we should both highlight more the internal diversity of national groups and critically assess the narratives and the starting assumptions we as political theorists also make when we talk about integration and immigration, and what kind of pictures we then present of our own group and of groups of others. But we also should start more to differentiate between the goals of integration. So is it about having someone participate equally, or is it also equally about protecting support for the welfare system? Is it about both? Is it about one more than the other? So what do we want to achieve when we talk about successful integration? And what kind of trust do we need for that? And I think, so doing these two things might have two effects. So first, we might better contribute to constructing a national identity that is more inclusive and more aware of its links and similarities with other nations and cultures, and thus lessen this prevailing pictures of us and them that we often have in the immigration discourse. But second, we might also become more aware of where integration is actually needed. So where there are maybe differing values or identities that stop trust that is needed from occurring, and where integration is not successful for other reasons. Because, for example, we do not see that there are actually similar values because they are abstracted through economic inequality or prejudices about other cultures. So yes, I think I should stop there. So yes, I think this is just making the picture maybe a little bit more nuanced and helps us to see in a certain sense where integration is needed, in what kind of sense we need integration, and how we can kind of fine-tune what values or convictions, etc., we should talk about when we talk about integration. Yes, I think that's it for now. Thanks.
Thank you, Kirsten. Do we have any questions? Okay, Kevin and then Helen.
Thanks, Kristen. I thought that was really interesting. I think it's an important issue to discuss. I wondered whether you would agree, so then, and this just relates to part of your talk, that political integration, in some contexts at least, will involve, it's more a matter of sort of translation than it is assimilation. It's not about like, you know, assimilating people and removing differences, but understanding that there are similarities, but there may need to be some sort of translation to sort of reveal where those similarities are. Does that make sense? So, you know, used like honesty as an example, that's a value we may share, but like markers of honesty may be different from one culture to another, and just being able to sort of translate, you know, from one person to the other, what is a marker of honesty, and how can we may notice it differently here than maybe in your country of origin. Just, yeah. So does that make sense? This idea of integration being more about a kind of translation than overcoming of difference.
Yeah, I think partially that might be exactly part of this, becoming more aware of similarities and links through this kind of translation work, also through becoming more aware how to interpret things, how to interpret certain behaviors of people. And then I think there's also a matter of trust on that level involved, right? That if something seems strange to me, that I do not immediately assume, well, this is because the other person is completely different because they're foreigner, right? They're just different. But trying to understand what is going on, having the goodwill to think that they are more aligned with my values, but I might not at the moment understand or show them the same way. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for that presentation. I wanted to ask a question in relation to the point on one of your slides about social integration. And I'm wondering if you can speak more to that, and I'll talk about why I think I'm asking this question, basically because I think when a sizable immigrant population comes into a new country, for instance, like off the top of my head, I'm thinking about the Turkish diaspora in Germany, for instance. They're socially integrated in the sense that they have built their own community, for instance. So there's a sense of community within that sort of in-group. But I wonder if what you mean is social integration into sort of the like the dominant German identity there, for example. And I'm wondering if you think that's that should be in one direction. So like Turkish people should integrate into the German identity there, or if whether you imagine that happening in two directions. Because again, like I said, I think just calling it maybe social integration is kind of limited in the sense that most immigrant communities especially build their own communities, but maybe there's a disconnect between sort of the dominant culture versus like the subculture. Yeah, so that was my question.
So I would understand kind of successful integration as partially not having these groups anymore, but having still bonds and good relations between those groups, right? So you can have immigrant communities and you can have that have maybe their primary social contacts within. But I would think what is necessary in order to say that there is social integration is that there are also good relations with people that are perceived as not being in this group, but as still not being perceived as, you know, strangers or foreigners. And so in that sense, I would think it's a two-way relationship, right? You cannot have a friendship or a good work relationship just from one side. And I think I think the Turkish diaspora in Germany is in a certain sense quite interesting because no integration has happened for a very long time, right? Because the idea for a very long time was that these are guest workers. They're coming in and then they are leaving. And of course, most of them didn't leave. They stayed in Germany, and there's no second, third generation. And so I wouldn't think that there is necessarily, so I would maybe differentiate between cultural and social integration, where maybe cultural integration comes closer to what you were maybe thinking of as like becoming more like Germans. But and social integration, I would think of as really like, okay, do we now have people from these communities who study at German universities, who work alongside Germans in jobs, or is it really completely different communities where, you know, like you have places there are only people with a Turkish immigrant background working, no Germans, and vice versa. I don't know whether that answers the question.
Okay, thanks so much, Kirsten. So you referenced Schinkel, right? I always mess up his name. Is it Schinkel or Schenkel? Schinkel, and he concludes from very similar premises that we should basically reject the idea of integration, right? Because there's nothing to integrate to. It's a social construct, and it only serves to basically impose these dominant narratives and oppress people. And I wonder what stops you from drawing that conclusion and why you maintain that integration is still a useful category. And if I can just add one thing to that. So, one of the persons who responds to Schinkel, not the book, but an article is Kakenbach is the name of this Dutch scholar. again, names are awful and I don't remember them. But basically, she ends up arguing what I think is a kind of a interesting idea that, well, we can reimagine integration as kind of aimed at social equality or relational equality or something like that. But then in the sense that also does away with integration, because that's a general goal that we should have for everyone, right? So it's not really specials. And it seems to me that a lot of literature on integration doesn't really, can't really do anything with the idea, because either it is something imagined, right, and it's just suppressive and dominating, or is just a general requirement that we have generally. It's nothing too special about immigrants, which are just treat them as equals, and that's integration, about which they treat everyone else as equals. So why do you think that integration is still this useful category? Thank you.
So I think there might be kind of two answers to that. So the first one with, okay, sorry, I kind of forgot the, what did I write down here? Okay, I'll start with the second and maybe you remind me. So I do actually think that the talk of integration does not necessarily just relate to the immigration context, right? So you have Elizabeth Anderson talking about integration in a context which is not immigration at all, which is a context about economic inequality, but also a racial one. And so I think I very much prefer or have her idea of integration on the background of really having good relationships and having relationships across different group boundaries. So in that sense, it does come very close to, yes, what we want to achieve is relational equality, right? But still, I mean, why not give a name to the process of achieving that, right? So, and one name can be integration. So we do not have this separation anymore. You want to build connections that are trusting, equal, etc. So I think if we think about integration in that way, I don't necessarily think that we need to get rid of it as a discourse itself. Yes, Schinkel. I'm not sure how to pronounce it. I just use the German pronunciation, and that might be very wrong. So, and there as well, I think, yes, I mean, it is a construct, and talk of integration might contribute in a certain sense, but I think, I mean, we had Gina this morning, but also others pointing out that even though it is a construct, it's very powerful, and it's something real that does impact us in our thinking. And I'm also not sure whether we can or should completely get rid of that. So I think it's a matter of acknowledging that people do have national identities, but also about thinking about, and I think that's a lot what Niels was talking about as well, how these national identities are shaped, and how distinct we make the boundaries in a certain sense, right? So how much we think about, is there a huge difference that cannot be bridged, which almost goes into an essentializing context, right? And that's also something that a lot of the post-colonial thinkers are talking about. Or is it more about there are different characteristics, but they are not completely homogeneous and they're not completely fixed? But as also Caroline's first question, I think, was leading to that, there might be, for example, some translation work that we need to do, and we should be aware of that, right? So not pretending that there is nothing when there is something.
Thank you, Kirsten. I was just like thinking, like, is there a need to return to the classical approach to trust, that trust has to be assumed? Because in this situation is that if we assume that immigrants can be trusted, then the question is that whether they can or cannot integrate to the society, because they will integrate this to the society, right? The question is just only when. So when that happens, then the question is not about the immigrants, but about the system. And again, if you trust the system, they will integrate to the society, right? And this goes back to the previous presentations too, that about the LGBTQ, that we have to trust that the application is actually, truthful, instead of questioning whether that is actually a fake document or not. So, but that is a classical, approach to trust, right? That it has to be assumed. Do you think that we're circling back to that need that we need to assume that, yeah, we should just trust people? Thank you.
Maybe yes. I think so that might be the kind of like the right way to go. I think the question is like, how do we get people to do that, right? Because people do not just, I mean, you can tell them it would be better to trust immigrants or whomever, they not do it without good reason. And so that's why I was, I think maybe I didn't talk about that much. That's part of what I'm trying to get at when talking about different contexts of trust, because then you have specific, so if you can identify specific things that people look at when they decide whether to trust someone or not, that helps you to then, when talking about immigrants and integration, etc., to highlight that there are similarities, right? That allows you to highlight, say, well, there are also, there are also these and these traditions or values held up in these countries, and they might look like this or that. So that you can give people, you don't have to just ask for blind trust, but you can give them reasons why they should trust in certain contexts others, instead of just saying, well, they are trustworthy people.
Kirsten, you're launched on a very ambitious project, and I'm glad you're doing it, because this is a field in which there's incredible conceptual complexity and often confusion. In this area, I think it might be useful to look at a paper written about 10 years ago by the Canadian sociologist Jane Jensen, who did a paper on what she called trying to understand the concept of social cohesion, which was a language that was used in this country some time ago. And we now use the language of integration, but I think we were talking about roughly the same thing. And I would just say Jane's approach was interesting because she argued strongly that the way to think about social cohesion or integration was to emphasize primarily participation. Participation of all the groups in society, particularly newcomers, in economic life, cultural life, social life, political life, and that a society could function well if you had high levels of participation of major groups and there weren't blockages or barriers to engagement in that sense. And Jane also argued, you get into trouble if you aim for cultural or value integration. You overestimate the similarity of the host society. I mean, the host societies are incredibly diverse internally, but so you create an imagined homogeneity on the host society side. And it's that when you try and aim for value consensus, you get into social conflict big time. So anyway, I'm going on too long. I would just recommend you look at that piece. It was a very nice conceptual framing, which I happen to agree with, which is why I'm recommending it. But and it's not the only way of thinking about this, but it's one attempt to impose some logic on the field.
Yeah, thanks. That sounds really helpful also in mapping out where. So what what kind of similarities we should highlight, which probably would be those that are needed for participation to work well, and in which areas, as you said, maybe cultural things where we actually do not need assimilation or integration in a certain sense for participation and equality to succeed.
Just before the next question, we have about 4 minutes left, just for timing
Okay.
purposes. Okay, so this is probably just a clarificatory question, but I was wondering if your 4 dimensions of integration, are they proxies for integration, or are they just what integration is? And because it struck me that they operated quite differently for maybe different groups, and it raised okay, so kind of anecdotally, my daughter was using like a real estate agent to get rental property in Toronto. It's so difficult. And we were told that white men and black men students, I mean, they would put in applications for like rental houses and they would fail at huge rates because people didn't really want all these men living together. But she was in with a sort of like 2 Chinese Canadian women, and their chances were the highest of anybody. Okay, so you have a so they were integrated into the rental market, but it doesn't. But then that's puzzling, right? Because if is that a proxy? Is that okay? That's a dimension of integration, but you can imagine that dimension of integration might fail on other things. There could be, I mean, the East Asian students might encounter blockages elsewhere. I'm just wondering, are they proxies for integration, or are they just what it is? I think how I'm trying to frame that question, but I am puzzled about the 4 and how they relate and how trust relates, because it looks like they might be different. Sorry,
Yes, thank you. So I think it was unclear and messy maybe. So these were just examples. So I didn't mean to say that like this covers all aspects of integration. The reason why I put up these 4 is because I think that those are often things that when people talk about integration, they think about it, like citizenship, having equality of opportunity, things like that. But then obviously as well, I think they are at least in 2 different categories, as I said, right? So some of these things, whether we want immigrants, but whether people are positive about immigrants kind of being integrated in that way, for example, getting citizenship, relies on very different notions of trust, which probably is more a generalized trust and maybe also institutional trust about whether the institutions make the right decisions about whom to give citizenship, etc., than the kind of trust that a landlord extends to an applicant for a flat, where exactly the dynamics that you just described might come in, which might run along cultural lines, but also along lines of gender or other things. So the point of these were more saying that, so these are some of the aspects, or when we talk about this very complex context of concept of integration, these are some of the things that we might think about as markers of successful integration, that these are things that you kind of like succeed at or are integrated in or have access to. But they rely on slightly different, what is it called? But we look at different things when making the decisions of whether to extend trust in these contexts. And so that's why we also shouldn't just say, for example, cultural integration is what is needed for integration as such to be successful, because there are all these other things as well. Because as you said, right, you can be completely culturally integrated and still be a white man, and people are like, no, you're like a noisy man who's not clean. I will not rate it. I'd rather give it to like a Chinese female student. So yeah.
Yeah, just very briefly. So I have a similar problem to Jolt, I think, that when you started talking about the social constructivist accounts, I got the impression that you wanted to break down certain group identities and say that they are less relevant in terms of how we frame the entire issue of integration. But then when you responded to Hale's question about the Turkish community in Germany, you precisely use these identity markers, right? The Turkish community, and be more like the Germans, which seems to go into quite different direction. And then you said in another response that Gina nicely this morning showed how strong and prevalent national identities are. But I mean, that's an empirical claim about the world in which we live, which is shot through with these kind of assumptions, which maybe you set out precisely to criticize. So I was a little bit wondering on which level you operated and what the relevant groups there are, because your account of integration seemed to be, based on Anderson, that you want to have better relations across group barriers, but then still the question is which ones are the relevant groups and how do we frame them and think of them?
So I think in the context of immigration, the groups that we're talking about, I would say they are still in a certain sense national groups, and I still think it is a construct, but it's still right. It's still in people's mind, and there are, and that's why I also picked this quote from Said. He says, "Well, these are things that exist," and I think I like that quote because it shows both of these both aspects. It's like you cannot do away with that, right? We can still say like the Canadians and the Germans. There is something also, in a certain sense, that at least we feel that we have in common with other co-nationals. But then it's not necessarily, but these things that we feel that we have in common are not necessarily the things that we need in order to cooperate well with others and to trust them. And so I think that's where the mix-up often happens when we talk about integration. And if we start pulling these two things apart, then we might still talk about like different cultures or nations without having to say that that these differences exist as a problem for integration, because this is not necessarily always the root cause for being able to trust or mistrust someone. There are lots of other things and values going on, economic, etc., that shapes how people relate to each other. And so this is sorry, my Fabian Versuch. What is it? So basically what I'm trying to show is that we should focus more on these similarities that are maybe not kind of like national ones, right? Because that is not, these are not the ones that we need in order to establish trust between groups.
All right, thank you all for your questions. Thank you, Kirsten, for your presentation. We have a short coffee break now, and we'll be back here at 3:15.
right, we'll do the same format as last time. We're like 15 to 20-minute presentations and question periods. And the first presentation we have right now is Nicholas Kirby of Harvard University on distrust, polarization, and disinformation.
to such an epistemic environment. So you might then say, well, no, but you don't get it. We're living in a monopolistic environment where the consumer choice is compromised. We have Facebook, Twitter. So this is a problem with social media companies, but it's the wrong problem for this problem, which is to say that just because you would kind of break up these companies wouldn't mean that you would increase the quality of information in these environments, or decrease the level of effective polarization in these environments. In fact, when we see different competitor organizations popping up, they actually tend to be less regulated and less epistemically kosher platforms, whether it's Truth Social or Parler or whatever. So it's not the monopoly might be a problem, but actually what the people want, even if we demonopolize, seems to be bad epistemic environments. And you might say that people's media choices are compromised. They're being manipulated, they're being epistemically incapacitated, they don't know what they're doing, they're not responsible for when they're choosing Facebook. I think that's that's a possible argument, but it's a bit of a strong argument to say that the vast majority of people who are joining Facebook are not responsible for their decision when they're engaging in it, or and if so, the response would be something like you would expect to cigarettes or alcohol or any addictive substance. Make people, inform them of the results before they take the choice. So that solution doesn't seem to be helping us out. So finally, you might think, well, maybe we just have a right to be in a functional epistemic ecosystem. We don't really just have a right to access it, we have a right to be in it. We have a right to be within a functional epistemic ecosystem, which entails that others do too, and which prohibits others, or at least a critical mass of others, associating in unhealthy epistemic bubbles. Is like a kind of negative externality on their behavior that we would have to suffer, and we have a right not to have to suffer this. So what does a healthy epistemic ecosystem look like? It does not preclude disinformation per se, but it does preclude systematically unchallenged disinformation. It requires epistemically reliable actors. It requires epistemic distrust to be sufficiently well distributed. The ecosystem would ensure that most individuals, at least the aggregate actions of individuals, such as voting, tend to choose correctly. So you might think, well, we have a right to live in this environment. The problem with this is that it just seems to justify such a wide scope of government intervention based on prohibiting, discouraging, and disincentivizing individuals from freely forming their own group based on their own beliefs and their own non-experts, right? It seems to be just too radical a incursion into kind of the general liberal ethoses, where you should be able to argue and do and think largely what you want. This would require the regulator to take a very strong stand on what the truth is, or at least who the experts are, and what constitutes good epistemic practices. And this would seem that, we bloody hell, this thing, how do I get rid of this thing? Oh, this would seem to bring all manner of civil society associations under threat of prohibition. Think tanks, religions, the wrong religions, of course, charities, political parties, the wrong political parties, Brexiteers, obviously, just wrong, libertarian economists, also wrong. So, all these people would just have to be eliminated because they're a negative externality of people having a right to think freely and spread disinformation amongst themselves. So that obviously, I think, is a bridge too far for the good democratic liberals in this room. And so the summary of my analysis of why there's a problem for me to solve with some other analysis is this. So here out there, I'm attributing to Barack and other people this argument, social media, it's misinformation that's the problem. That's what ultimately is leading to democratic harm, and we're going to regulate the misinformation. And I'm saying, if you think that's the problem, then we have a really big problem in trying to justify regulating misinformation at the same time maintaining our basic liberal values. And hopefully I've bolstered that through a series of analysis of responses and replies. So what's a better analysis, a better way in which we might ground some form of regulation of social media? So my alternative suggestion is what I'm calling a kind of distrust analysis. So Yeah. So the epistemic analysis, social media, misinformation, epistemic dysfunction, democratic harm, therefore regulation. Distrust analysis, social media leads to effective content, polarization, practical distrust, injustice, regulation. Okay, so let me try and justify this. So what is effective polarization? I'm guessing everyone is pretty much up on the effective polarization concept in this room, but effective polarization is the refers to a tendency to dislike and distrust the opposition and impute negative characteristics to them. You know, and obviously it runs contrary to ideological polarization. There's a whole lot of work on that. But the most important feature for me here is the degree in which distrust is either a very strong causal output of effective polarization, or depending on your definition, is a constitutive feature of effective polarization. And this kind of effective polarization is also very closely tightly bound up with a sort of social identity analysis of the way in which people form groups within our political contexts. And so, you know, here's a sort of bit of research about, you know, how social media is seen to be kind of a causal relation, a cause of effective polarization within society. And I'm going to sort of take that as largely given in this talk. So that's effective polarization. What's the analysis? Social media is an environment that promotes effective content that sustains its user engagement. Effective content facilitates the forming of in and out group dynamics and associated social identities defined in opposition to one another. This polarization leads not merely to antipathy, but distrust as a constitutive feature. And that then leads to practical distrust is an injustice, or it's a costly burden on members of society, and thus prima facie an injustice. So it's this last part here that I want to just emphasize. So this was the kind of output of the paper I did for the preceding workshop of this. And it's either distrust is a burden. So I'm a kind of more of a Hawley fan than a Jones fan, but under the sort of rough Hawley analysis of what distrust is, distrust entails a subjective risk of unjust harm, quite a breach of kind of moral obligation. This is the Kirby version of Hawley. If one leaves oneself vulnerable to the distrusted. Such a subjective risk is an ill, qua burden that kind of disvalues our normative position, right? So it's something where, all right, I thought I was safe. Now I think I'm not safe. Therefore, I've got to probably, if I'm rational, I've got to go through a series of costly measures, insurance, defense, avoidance in response to that. So our position is kind of made worse off the minute we feel that we're in a subjective, a kind of position of distrust. And the burden of distrust often escalates as a response to distrust leads to reciprocal distrust. So if you kind of buy this basic analysis, and this was the burden of the previous paper, but let's say that paper stands, let's say that R&R goes through, it is pro tanto wrong to knowingly create it without justification. Since distrust is a burden, creating distrust without justification, you know, and those justifications could be consent, reciprocated benefit, etc., is a wrong. Let's say we kind of buy this basic argument. Creating distrust at the individual level. Well, at the individual level online, participants on social media typically, but not always, either do not knowingly create distrust by their actions, or if they do, they have a justification. This holds true, especially if we think good faith political engagement is a justification. So if you go back to the various kind of examples I gave earlier. But here's the kicker. Here's what I'm kind of trying to get towards. At the aggregate level, this no longer holds true, because social media companies knowingly and indeed arguably intentionally create, through effective polarization, distrust for profit. They're not even engaging in politics, right? They're just trying to create profit, and profit is not a sufficient justification for creating distrust. Thus, social media companies pro tanto wrong us by producing effective polarization. And this is effectively, I think, a version of what Frances Haugen was saying to the US Commerce Committee about Facebook. And just to end, here are some basic implications. Misinformation does not necessarily create or sustain distrust. amongst the critically capable, or if it's not politically salient. Hence, not all or indeed most information needs to be regulated. Since distrust frames our mode of interpreting data, then the wrong of spreading distrust explains why often the problem with misleading information is not the information itself, but the interpretive frame in which the recipient has been placed, which is of course done by the companies. Unwarranted distrust can prime us to draw false implications. In part, due to distrust being a function of recipient framing, individuals may not know, indeed perhaps rarely know, that they're creating distrust by their posts. They may not, or indeed rarely, be culpable, but social media platforms do tend to know about the risk of trust. Like, they know what they're doing with the content that you give them. They know the distrust that they're creating. And they're the ones who are effectively being culpable, even if the individuals are not culpable. This distrust is not wrongful if justified, but social media companies don't really have a good justification. So the relevant wrongful harm of social media is the aggregated effect, qua distrust, of publicizing user conduct, misinformation or not, for which the social media company, not the users, are primarily responsible. Thus, the social media company may wrong us even if the users do not. Thank you.
All right, does anyone have any questions? Do we have another microphone? Oh, okay.
Yeah, thank you. Great, thanks, Nick. I really like this paper. Two questions. Why doesn't the free choice association contract stuff matter in the second case? Why couldn't someone say that, well, you know, these are consenting adults, they should just label it, right? So when you sign up to Facebook, you should say it might create this distrust, this burden, you, and that you consent to accepting that burden is not unjust anymore. And whatever you say to that, what doesn't apply to the previous case? And the second question is, or it's a comment, I think, is I think so when you said that when the regulator takes a stance on expert censorship and stuff, that kind of undermines lots of liberties. I think that a little bit underestimates how much we are already doing that. I mean, there are lots of cases in which the state takes a stance on who experts are on epistemic issues, notably in education, right, and in all sorts of policymaking where they do rely on experts and stuff like that, and it doesn't seem problematic. Or if it is, that I think that has implications for this line of view as well, right? So, for example, in education, we think that the state is entitled to make decisions about what the truth is, whether, you know, they should teach creationism or evolution in schools or not. And that's partly because the whole enterprise of education, it has this kind of core epistemic function. But then you might say that democracy too has a core epistemic function. It's part of why we do democracy, is because we want to make good decisions, epistemically good decisions. And so therefore that might justify allowing the state to make those kind of calls on who an expert is, what the truth is, at least within certain limits, similar to how we do in education. Thanks.
Yeah, great. Response to the first question, I think that's a good question. My basic response would be, it definitely works where the cause is the fact that we have to live with a whole lot of distrust caused by other people using social media, regardless of whether we use social media or our particular usage of social media. So the liberal stuff explains why if we end up being distrust or burdened by our particular usage of it, but it's not like we're consenting to the fact that I can no longer distrust 30% of America to abide by the Constitution because they've used social media. I haven't consented. I don't see how I've consented to that when I signed up to Facebook, if I've signed up to Facebook. Oh, exactly. So I think Fox News is, I'm happy to embrace it as a test case, halfway between what separates social media from Facebook. in part because I don't think they're engaged in good faith politics. So I'm happy for this argument to start to push out to grab social media. And as far as I know, loosely the empirical research, which all of course I'm obliged to do as a political philosopher. So yeah, one of probably maybe the bigger driver of effective polarization in the US is a Fox rather than social media. On your second question, yes, but you've gone to education, which is the biggest area, the most where they do regulate what truth is. But the case here is more analogous to banning private schools, because Facebook is like, hey, you can have your government-run social media website, sure, whatever. Actually, India's you might be good at this, but what about going? This is about saying no, you can't have your Facebook, you can't have your own information. So, yeah.
We have one question right there. Just really quick, I want to jot down who else has a question, just so I know. All right, you're gonna go.
So yeah, thank you for that presentation. That was really interesting. I want to ask two sort of related questions. The first is whether or not you think, who gets to regulate these social media companies, whether or not you think they're reliable to self-regulate on this matter? No. Okay, so you think the government ought to regulate them. Do you think the government is reliable to regulate them on this matter? That's one question. And the second is where you draw the line between sort of like a social media company that's invested in profit and sort of individual actors, for instance, someone like Joe Rogan, who does like a really famous podcast, and he clearly makes money off of disinformation and misinformation, right? So where you draw the line between a company that ought to be regulated versus a person's individual pursuit of profit toward this end. So yeah, those are
yeah.
And how do we regulate individuals on this?
Yeah, look, I suppose this paper is about trying to isolate the wrong at a kind of moral level that gives the kind of a basis for regulation if it's not necessarily sufficient. Obviously, there might be reasons where you don't want to regulate a potential wrong because you don't trust the state, and that might depend on the quality of your state cost context. I do think though that the thing about this trust analysis is it's like the companies know it. Like they know what causes distrust. They know what causes effective polarization. They're building it into their algorithms. So it's not that hard to say, don't do that. Don't put that factor in there, or don't put that set of factors that are proxies for it in there. Like it's not an impossible thing, and that doesn't politically problematic to do, because it's not even saying don't regulate things because they're true or false. It's going because it causes effective distrust. I think the good response then is to say, but surely sometimes we want distrust. Sometimes we want warnings. Warnings about bad actors create distrust, but they're justified. And I think on that case, what you have to say is either social media shouldn't be used as that platform for that, or that you have to say, no, that this justification holds there. And there you take a stand on the truth. But there you have to say, we think it's justified to create distrust because the onus of proof has now been shifted to say, yes, because we are going to back this as the truth. And there you're acting more like a media company than you are like a so-called apolitical platform. Your second question, I don't want to necessarily let individuals off the hook. If individuals are also engaged in knowingly creating distrust for profit, then let's get them too. But I think the main vector of the social media companies, and let's focus on them.
Hi. So my question, I really enjoyed this presentation, but
Mostly the jokes or the content?
yeah, your energy actually is really great for the afternoon slump. And the content, but I did wonder how it would work. So one of the thoughts that I had, you were talking about algorithms and regulating algorithms, and that seems easy. But one of the real difficulties that we have in democracies is that political parties and agents that want polarization can introduce lies.
Yeah.
And then even if you fact check them and say, oh no, this turns out to be not true, then they've actually gained control of the political conversation so that too much energy is spent saying what isn't true, right?
Yeah.
And so it's completely distorting to democracy. And there it seems like it's actually pretty hard to regulate because I mean, you can imagine the picture, right? Like, you know, Jews control banks, and then, you know, then you spend a month showing that that this is actually not true. And in the meantime, you shouldn't even be having this conversation. So, I mean, in that case, it looks like it's a much harder problem to regulate. And it looks like that it's, I mean, more destructive to the whole idea of Mill's, you know, marketplace of ideas and being on a neutral footing. And so I just wondered what if you had an analysis of that, or how you had a market driven, oh, they're just doing it for money, but this might be doing it for political ends. So I just wondered what you thought about that, Jason thought.
Yeah. I mean, I kind of think from all the political shows that I've watched, the spin doctors would say, what you don't do is try to counter that information, you just ignore it, right? And I think that's salient here, because what I would say is Facebook would say, yeah, sure, let them say that. Just don't distribute it to anyone. Or set the algorithm to distribute it to where it's impactful in the internet. And part of what I'm trying to do here, though it's not top of mind in this talk, is to separate the idea of how we're regulating social media companies from traditional free speech debates. So you can say, yeah, everyone can say what, it's kind of consistent with my position to say almost anyone can say whatever they want on the internet, in a social media. Wait, no one's going to stop you typing whatever you want into social media or putting a video up saying whatever you want. It's about who the social media company then sends it to and how it aggregates that information. And so once we disconnect that freedom on the individual side from the freedom of the social media company to do whatever it wants from, then we actually get much more tractable to say, okay, we can regulate this while letting people say whatever they want down here. And I think we can then say we're going to regulate this on the basis of, at least on one major reason, not creating effective polarization. That's kind of what I'm saying.
Thank you. I was banned on Facebook a few weeks ago, actually, but that's not my question. So what is the role of...
Just going to leave that for us?
What is the role of power here? Because when Obama won first time, people were saying that one of his largest supporters were actually those who were based on social media, right? So we're talking about the economy of attention here. So, and power, of course, has influences on the economy. So the question is that why is it that the Democrats did not, instead of using regulation, because we don't want to disturb the public sphere, instead of using regulation, why don't they use their power to shift the economy from misinformation circulation to other kind of circulation? Because your argument is that the companies will not touch those who are spreading misinformation or disinformation because it's profitable for them, right? So if that's the case, why don't we try other power who believe in, I would say positive democracy to change that trend of economy?
So I didn't quite understand the point. So you want the government to change the incentive structure of Facebook so that they're not rewarded by misinformation?
It doesn't have to be in the government, but it can be in power. So it can be, I don't know, investors, it can be in the market that tries to provide incentives.
I mean, I suppose I just don't see how, I mean, disinformation, I mean, the part of what was in the first part of the talk was to say it's disinformation, not just a part of the problem. So my first argument was actually trying to take some of the burden of misinformation as what is then causing effective polarization. Let's go, Brandon is not disinformation. It's a joke. It's a punch to the Democrats. It's wrapped up as a joke, right? And so much of the internet, it's operating on this level. And that's part of what's creating this sort of social this solidarity of you in on the joke. It's the in-group, out-group dynamics. So the pathways to creating effective polarization don't necessarily go via the information epistemic, rational kind of evaluating policy kind of function. I mean, it's just straight through the who are our enemies and who are our friends kind of pathway. So that's the first part. Let's not put part of this analysis is saying if you think misinformation is the problem, then you're missing a lot of the story of how social media works. The second is that even if to what part that is operating is information disinformation part, then that was the rest of the talk on the liberal stuff. To your point, I mean, sure, but information, I don't know, the profit motive seems way too big. Like they've done the data, like they've looked at how their market works. They know that just clicking the effective response button is how you keep people engaged, and they make a lot of money out of it. So trying to creating another incentive to change and getting enough investors to come in and want to change that, I think seems to me implausible. I'm all for it, but I don't know, it doesn't seem to me like a very hopeful cause.
Okay, I think we'll just take one more from this gentleman here because I know the cabs are going to be here at, I think, 5. So just in the interest of time.
It just crossed my mind now, but because you defend a very liberal way you defend a liberal way of regulating social media. So if you believe that social media, they can steer kind of effective polarization, don't you have a sort of strange picture of the self and the human being that is a little bit non-liberal? Because as a liberal, you also believe that people are autonomous, right? And don't you have a picture of them as completely, a sort of behavioristic picture of them in which I can really manipulate them and which doesn't really fit your liberal picture to some extent?
Yeah. I think for the purposes of my response to reviewer 1, I'm just very loosely, I'm just liberal, I'm not a liberal, I'm just these liberal rights. You can be attracted to them on whatever basis you like, but they seem like pretty attractive rights to have on any basis, and that's all I need to do the job. There's no necessary self-conception of the human being behind them. But so I don't need to be tied to any deeper analysis. I just say these seem like attractive things to have, and if we accept that they're attractive things to have, then my argument follows through. But this is something I've been kind of toying with at the back of my mind for a while, which is what social media companies bring to the fore is, well, we always know we've had these mob and aggregative effects and this kind of we act as individuals in this way, but then we're very predictable in very large groups, and we act as a function of those aggregate effects. And yet we've never had these companies, people have had, or organizations that have such dexterous control over those effects before. And so social media companies suddenly bring to mind, well, how do we balance these things together, and what responsibilities arise at that level of power? And I don't know how that all fits together. I think it's the right big question. Yeah, all I can say is I share the question.
One more.
Go on, one more.
Yeah, we'll do one more.
We started late.
I just want to follow up on that quickly. I mean, so if you accept that they have that power over us and can sort of manipulate us in that way, then I wonder if that should cause you to rethink what you described earlier as the limits to those rights. I mean, so maybe in this digital age, we need to think about those limits a little differently, because we now have this, these very powerful companies influencing us. I wasn't entirely convinced in that part of the paper that we should accept that version you were giving of what those limits are, especially maybe in this digital age. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think the devil's probably in the detail, and I think there's a lot of weight on that last bit I kind of throw in at the end, which is like, look, you know, if we're going to be if you're going to regulate basically saying we've got a right to live in a epistemically functional ecosystem. I was saying, well, if that's what we got, then the implication is we should be able to regulate out all people who are disrupting that, who include lots of people who are not violent. You know, you seem to be, you know, that, and now I'm putting the boot into the Brexiteers and the libertarian economists. And so I suppose I think a lot. I suppose my argument seems to be whatever justification that seems to be too illiberal. You know, you seem to be committed to being a little bit too heavy-handed with people you disagree with, because you disagree with them, right? Because you're still
their
stuck in the
statements can have
misinformation.
such impact
Pardon?
online. I mean, their statements can have such impact that, you know, they can't have in just some interpersonal exchange. Like I think saying Blue Lives Matter, I think that's a microaggression that can have significant harm in a social media context if it gets tweeted around all over the place. So, you know, anyway, maybe that there should be a limit on free speech in that context to make comments like that. But
Sure. I better cede the stage to the final act. I believe they put the best on last. Thanks, and I better take this off because it was just so useful during the talk, wasn't it? Probably should have. I should have switched. Did I have myself muted? Oh, what a- Huh? Yeah, I used to be at Harvard and now at University of Glasgow. I'm just a research fellow. It was Oxford, then it was Harvard, now it's Glasgow. Yes. Oh, luckily not under any time constraints.
Turn this on. It's already on, right?
Is it green? Yes.
Does it hear me? Yeah.
This is your first.
That's my first slide. Hide floating meeting controls.
Okay, up next, last but not least of the day, we have Margaret Moore of Queen's University on trust, solidarity, and justice.
Right. Thank you very much. Thanks to the organizers for inviting me. I mean, this has been actually a really interesting conference so far. I think it's going really smoothly, and I'm really happy to be here and to be invited. It's my first time in Newfoundland, to meet everybody. And I think I'm going to say something similar to what Fabian said at the beginning, which is that most of my work is on land and territory. So I don't see myself as somebody who really works on trust or solidarity, but there is lurking in that work the idea of peoplehood, right? Like there has to be a holder of territorial rights, like a holder of jurisdictional rights, and whoever the holder is has to be a collective agent. So I've sort of skimmed around this sort of literature without ever committing to doing a presentation on it. So thank you very much for forcing me to do that, to thinking about it. And although I think I had a talk that says in the program something larger, I'm really only going to talk about solidarity because that seemed like a big enough topic for me to begin to get a handle on. So so it's basically just on solidarity. How do I move this forward? I just press the arrows. Do I? Well, not for me. Like just here, right? I did. That wasn't working. Ah, now I got it working. Okay, so I'm going to first define solidarity. So this is just out of the Oxford English Dictionary. So it's a noun, and it says unity or agreement of feeling or action, especially among individuals with a common interest. And the second definition is mutual dependence. So there's a number of things going on in this definition. I mean, I guess one might ask me why I would go to that definition, but part of it is solidarity could be a term of art, but I want to see how we use it in ordinary language to see what the connections are. And so unity of feeling and action are quite different. And then there's this idea of common interest. And then I think the second point about mutual dependence suggests some kind of egalitarian bonds. So that's how it's defined. There's different concepts of solidarity. And I'm going to talk pretty briefly about all of them. There are probably more, but these are in the literature. There's a sort of teleological solidarity. And this is the idea of collective action with shared aims. So the idea of it is that it has aims or ends. There's and so where the object of solidarity are the ends. There's loyalty solidarity, where the group that you're loyal to is the object of solidarity. So the object is the group. There's Kantian solidarity, and here I read Avery Kohler's book, and he describes his account as Kantian, where he describes it as reason-driven political action on others' terms. And then there's another account. I wasn't happy with, well, I especially wasn't happy with Avery's, and I was kind of trying to fuse these accounts. And then having come to a partial definition, I read Andrea Sangiuliani, and it was like what I was going to say, only better. So this is sort of mine with his. Joint collective action between agents who share some basis of identification. And I sort of qualified that the basis of identification is typically rooted in shared interests, experiences, and conditions. So those are the four accounts kind of prevalent in the literature about what solidarity is conceptually. Okay, so I'm going to start. So I will talk about that. So that's the structure of the talk. So when I think about solidarity, I think about the classic appeal to solidarity, and that's Marx, workers of the world unite. And it implies that individual workers should be in solidarity with each other and with unions and organizations intended to emancipate them from capitalism. I think that's the core idea. But there's also another idea implicit, which is that different unions should be in solidarity with each other. And this is even when their interests somewhat diverge. I mean, I'm not going to really talk about that, but it's like the idea of that different unions or different workers are, and it suggests that should be in solidarity. And it suggests that we have a shared fate as workers and shared interests as workers to overthrow capitalism. So I think that's the classic account. Interestingly, Avery Kohler's has another example of solidarity. And so part of my interest is motivated by the fact that I think this example is a weird example, and I think it leads him into the wrong direction. So his central example is Rosa Parks. He has a JPP article where he begins with it, but even in his book, he has this example several times. And so Rosa Parks, you probably know, is an African-American activist who was very crucial to ending bus segregation. And to show, so she was arrested, so the way it worked was that in Alabama in 1954, really since 1900, buses would have whites at the front, usually in the first 4 rows, and blacks at the back. And blacks were 75% of ridership, maybe even more. So they could move up the rows, African Americans could move up the rows if the white section wasn't filled. But if white section was filled, they were forced to move back, and they'd put a sign and put it back. So she was asked to move back when the white section was filled, and she refused. She was arrested. So Avery says, well, in solidarity with Rosa Parks, any white rider should have left the bus. That's a central idea of solidarity. And I mean, I think that's true for all kinds of reasons, because this is an egregious injustice. But I'm worried about this as an idea of solidarity. I mean, I think that it might have been morally incumbent on the white riders to do that. But then I'm wondering, is that our classic idea of solidarity? And so where I'm going to end is to say that I think there's a difference between solidarity and allyship. And those whites might be allies, but I'm not sure that they're in solidarity. So that's the end claim that I want to make. Because I think we now have that idea. I'm going to talk about that. But our current use of the term extends from the case of a group in solidarity to the idea of allies of a group also in solidarity. And I really think that a distinction could be helpful here. So there's another kind of component to Avery Kohler's desiderata of a good account, which I do need to mention, because otherwise my criticisms won't make sense. And I want to explain it, is that it incorporates the idea of deference. So I think there is a point, but I think that I think we may want to ask whether it should be deference. So he says, and I think it's generally held, that in collective action, individual judgments have to be subordinated to the group. So the individual, to be in solidarity, must defer to the group. I think that's a very rational formulation, a very cognitive formulation. But the example is a little compelling. So his example is, imagine that it's May 1st and there's a mass protest about current injustice. And I believe that everybody should go out and protest. So I want to go out and protest. And suppose my union says to me, oh, on the day of the protest, we need you to look after the phones. Now, I don't agree with this. I think I should be out there. So suppose instead of like looking after the phones on the day, I go out and protest. So I'm waving my flag. I'm in agreement with their aims. Am I in solidarity? That's the question. And the answer Avery gives, and I think it's the right answer, but not the right analysis. So the right answer is, I don't think if I did that, I am in solidarity because I'm not doing my part in this collective action. I'm acting on my own judgment and conscience. So Avery Kohler says, and many people agree, that some kind of deference to the collective is implicit in solidarity. I'm just going to say, I'm also a little worried because a lot of activism is very democratic, right? Like, and that seems a very authoritarian formulation and very rational formulation. I just wonder why we just couldn't describe it as collective action and it would do the work. But anyway, so that's what I say at the end. I mean, why are we calling it deference? But you do see the point. You can't just, because it comes up with the next account. A lot of accounts of solidarity are what you might think of as teleological solidarity. Solidarity understood as the pursuit, together with others, of shared political goals. So the idea is you have a political aim or a goal, and you are pursuing that goal with other people. And so it's instrumental collective action is teleological, not in any consequential, like not in any consequentialist way, justified by the ends that agents seek. And the problem with this account, and the reason that people are worried about end-based solidarity, is that Avery Kohler says, well, it has trouble explaining deference. So you can see what the problem is. If solidarity just is end-based action, then if groups disagree about to achieve the end, then it will turn out to be reducible to individual conscience. Like, I'll do it if I believe in it, and you'll do the same thing if you believe in it, but it's like an alliance, or it looks like a coalition, it looks like different. So the end-based account can't be the full story. So that's another account. I think the most thickest account is Alistair McIntyre's account and his loyalty solidarity. And this account, so the question here is about the relationship of the individual in solidarity with the group. And so what McIntyre says is that what's central here is that the individual submits their own agency and judgment to that of the larger group. It answers the deference problem. It's the idea of loyalty. So the idea is that there are relationship bonds between the individual and group. These relationship bonds are necessary. And so the object of solidarity is, in a sense, the group. It's almost preceding. What's the problem with loyalty solidarity? I actually think there is a kind of problem with loyalty solidarity described as he did. Because, so one of the criticisms is that loyalty is one thing and solidarity is another. They might be cognate notions, but they're not exactly the same notion. I think that's probably right. And here's why. You might, because you might have loyalty to family members, and there might be things that they don't want to tell other people, like dark family secrets. Okay. So out of loyalty, you wouldn't say them. But that doesn't look like it's solidarity. It looks, right? It looks like solidarity has a much more reasoned, looks like it is more reasoned than just simple loyalty. But it could be that loyalty is a component. So on this account, loyalty is the relationship that binds the individual with the group, so it's the object of the individual's obligation. But in solidarity, there must be a reason that binds the individual to the group, and the reason is the object. But I mean, if we move straight to the reason being the object, I think we're back in teleological solidarity. So we need a fusion, clearly, right? So Kohlers has a Kantian account of solidarity, and he defines solidarity as reason-driven political action on others' terms. That's his definition. It captures the idea that solidarity is differential in the way that I said in the union example, right? When you go out and protest and you should be looking after the phones, although I don't like the idea of differential. And it captures the idea that there's some, and he says that it must be some general reason that binds the individual to the group. And it's the reason rather than the group that is the object of individual's obligation. So that's the Kantian component of the account. And he uses the example of Rosa Parks on the bus in the segregated South in order to explicate this account. So it's the idea that we all recognize the reason that she was forced to move from the bus as the object of solidarity. But as I said, I found that an odd example, and I find it now a very rational example, like a very rational account of solidarity, and it only avoids the deference complaint, the idea that it will collapse into individual ends by including the idea of deference. So by talking about the Rosa Parks example, Avery Kohlers is able to say that solidarity is a political principle of how one ought to treat people. And he singles out fundamental fairness or equity or equal status. And that's how we have obligations of solidarity to treat obligations to be in solidarity with people who are treated inequitably. So that's the claim. Note, however, that we obviously have obligations to people who are treated inequitably. I think we have many obligations to people. Like that's now doing a lot of the work, right? The idea that people are treated inequitably and unfairly, like it's clearly wrong. And then we do have third-party obligations. But now it's hard to see, I don't know if it's about solidarity exactly. So what are the advantages and disadvantages of this new Kantian account? So one advantage is it highlights the differential nature of solidarity, but because he says it's action on others' terms, I mean, I'm not really comfortable with this differential account, but it does capture the idea that it can't resolve to the individual, like the individual conscience to be in solidarity. Although, you know, you don't need to have deference as the account, you could have something else, which I'll end. The disadvantage, it looks like a moralized notion. I mean, I am not against moralized notions, but you wouldn't want to stick the bunny in the hat, you've got the rabbit in the hat, and then stick it out again and say, this is a good thing, right? Like that doesn't look like a really good trick. So if you put the moral claims that it is on equitable terms, it rather looks like you can explain the obligation well. And I think it also, and this is where I want to end in a way, it also has the effect that it applies generally to any group because it's appealing to reasons and the reasons are general, and that goes back to the Rosa Parks example, it applies not only to the people who are suffering the oppression, but it applies as a reason to anybody who recognizes that as an injustice, right? So that's why he was able to say that the white riders on the bus should, in solidarity, exit the bus, which I agree they should, but not, I don't think that's the kind of solidarity. And for that reason, I think that it fails to take seriously a distinction that I think makes sense, which is between solidarity and allyship. And so the ethics of allyship, there's only like, I think is a more new literature, but I think that that perhaps needs to be put in play here to explain what the problem is. So here's the thought. Can we combine? So I said that I was uncomfortable with the idea of deference, and I actually know that I'm uncomfortable with it without yet knowing what the answer to it is. So this is somewhat speculative, but or at least I'm reaching for things yet without being clear. So I think that we need to have an account of reasons and aims. And I think we also need to have an account that doesn't collapse into individual judgment, but I wonder if we want it to be deferential. So here's the thought. So here's a definition first, that solidarity is a form of joint collective action between agents who share some basis of identification, and that this basis of this identification may be rooted in shared interests, experiences, and conditions. But movements and institutions must construct the collective identity, sort of as workers of the world, to establish solidarity amongst members. So similar experiences of oppression or burdens can be a source of shared identification that grounds solidaristic action. That seems to me to be what's really going on. And if that is going on, then we don't need to appeal to deference as a cognitive thing. We're appealing to a shared basis of identification. We're appealing to their shared interests and shared experiences and shared conditions in order to have relations of solidarity. So relationships become important on this account. And the appeal to joint collective action is what prevents it from collapsing into individual judgment. So now this is my last slide. You'll be happy to know. And you don't really need to read those little tiny words, but I need to, because I'm on my last slide and I'm tired, is the distinction between solidarity and allyship. So I think that we do have a responsibility to address inequality and injustice, as in that Rosa Parks example, but I don't think we should stretch the concept of solidarity to cover this. So this is like kind of my intuition, and I'm trying to make an argument for it. So solidaristic groups, and I was thinking of indigenous peoples, but even like landless peasants, social movements, they need allies. But these allies, and I'm thinking here now about non-indigenous peoples or townspeoples who are sympathetic, are not really in solidarity with the indigenous group or the landless peasant. It's better to maybe think of them as allies of them. And to be allies in some cases may involve actual deference, because it might involve, if there's epistemic reasons to think that the oppressed group have knowledge of what's needed and about how to proceed. So there you do need some kind of deference. It's not clear that it's the individual to the group that's implicit in collective action, but in allyship, I think there is a real need for deference, because otherwise it looks imperialistic and like it's taking over. And then here's where I got the helpful move from San Giovanni, which is that he says that solidaristic joint action entails sharing the risks and burdens of political struggle, that we have to share costs, we have to share fate. And it's not clear to me that the privileged or the non-indigenous or people who don't suffer the oppression can really proportionately share the same burdens. So they can be allies, but if that's a condition, then it's wrong to think of them as in solidarity. It's better to think of them as allies. And to be allies, the other group has to accept you as an ally and you have to operate on their terms. So that's right, but that's not to say that the individual in the solidaristic group has to defer. I'm trying to say that allies do have to defer, but not individuals in the solidaristic group. And that's the end.
Okay, thank you so much, Margaret. And we do have time for a few questions. So let me just take notes here. So we've got you, or yeah, Rachel will go that side first. And then who else had their hands up? Sorry. Okay.
I don't really know this literature very well, but I was just wondering, does the solidarity, this doesn't seem transparent from the definitions, but because they seem largely about trying to work out various ways in which you could be a part of a type of group. But I'm wondering, does solidarity require an enemy by definition? Is there a Schmittian premise to the very idea of solidarity? Or can you have solidarity with respect to without having someone that's perceived as an enemy? And then does that, I mean, that actually fits very well with the idea of allyship, because allyship is metaphorically from the context of war. But it just didn't seem transparency from the definitions that you had above that you were doing anything except kind of describing various forms of collective or joint action, which seemed over-inclusive. And then anyway, I'll just leave it there.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I think that the idea of reason-driven action just suggests that you have to have something reason-driven that you're trying to change. But if you think that you have a group that shares a burden, then I think that you must have groups that aren't part of your group. I don't know if that gets you full agonism, like an antagonistic group, but it does suggest that you have an in-group, and it does suggest that you have to have something that you're struggling. I mean, if you have a social movement, there must be sort of structural conditions that need to be changed. Now, whether or not you want to identify the beneficiaries or the perpetrators, this might be another question. But I'm inclined to say I should think about that, but possibly.
Thank you, Margaret. That was really interesting. Interesting in part for me because it introduced me to some theories on solidarity that I wasn't familiar with, but ones I am. I just wanted to make a couple of recommendations. So Meena Krishnamurthy, who you know, she actually wrote a paper on solidarity a number of years ago, and her conception is similar to yours in requiring collective identification. I don't know if you've read that piece. I also wanted to recommend Sally Schultz. So, you know, I share your intuition about deference, and I think Sally does too, but she gives an alternative of what sort of obligations you have as a person in solidarity. It, you know, may require that you don't act in ways that are sort of against the solidaristic goals you're all working to achieve, but that's different than having to defer to other members. I just want to say I don't share your intuition about solidarity versus allyship. I think you can be an ally in solidarity with others. I think they can come together. But it really depends. I mean, there are thinner and thicker notions of solidarity. There are ones that there are more conditions in them. Meena's has a lot. Yeah. Sally's has very few. So if you have a thinner notion, I think you can definitely see how those two can come together. You can be an ally in solidarity, which rings more true to me, but I don't have an argument for that.
No, that's helpful. I mean, I did actually, when we had different Meenas and we had drinks and we talked about it, and I never read her paper because it was after I did this presentation. Although I've read some of Sally Schultz. I suppose the question, I mean, there might be a solidarity so when you're talking about solidaristic groups, then you have clear, I mean, I think we use solidarity in different ways and the meanings are different. So when we're talking about a solidaristic group where you're making claims on the individual to be in solidarity with the group, that looks different than when you use the language of you should do this in solidarity. And then I think that group is an ally and you can use the word solidarity, but you're extending it. I think you might be extending it. But I think that if we extend it to all kinds of groups who see themselves as allies, I mean, it runs into kinds of problems. So I guess that's what because I think that the idea of deferring to what the people who are experiencing oppression, I mean, if we're like, so my concern is that the only time I think that there ought to be some kind of deference is deferring to the kinds of claims that people who are suffering the oppression have. So in order to capture that, we still would need some kind of distinction. I think that was kind of my thought there, but that's very helpful. Thanks.
The gentleman here next, and then the gentleman behind him afterwards.
Thanks, Margaret. I really enjoyed that, and I share a lot of your intuitions. But when you talked about solidarity, you talked a lot about oppressed groups. So is that a necessary condition? So Darren Moendorf works on solidarity in the context of climate change, and he has the nice, I call it now for lack of a better word, example of white miners in South Africa striking because they were worried about losing their jobs to Black South Africans. So they have a joint identification, and they feel that they're under threat. And Darrow says, yeah, that's solidarity. So we still need on top of that something which explains to us what is good solidarity and what is bad solidarity, what is justified solidarity, what not. I was wondering whether that is built into your account because you talked a lot about oppression. And the second point, I think the point about allyship is really important. And also maybe to say more about what kind of deference is needed, especially since Avery uses the Rosa Parks case so much. And there's obviously that beautiful Martin Luther King quote about the biggest obstacle to Black freedom is not the Ku Klux Klan, but it's a white moderate, because they say, oh, we agree with your goals, but we don't agree with your strategy. And that doesn't seem to be even allyship possibly on your, and I think you could actually use that in the context of that paper because it fits quite nicely.
Yes. Okay, so I'm inclined to think, yes, I do talk about people who are suffering injustice and oppression, and especially at the end, like at least in those main examples, but I don't want to put it in the conditions for solidarity that yet they have to have suffered. I mean, there's different kinds of concerns that people can have. So precarity is really so in the case of the miners, they're worried about precarity. So they might be privileged in relation to other axes, right? But I don't want to indicate that they're always victims of oppression, which always makes their action correct, like all things considered, right? So, I mean, in fact, I'm a little worried about the idea that, I mean, I couldn't get a good example, but where solidarity, so in Avery's kind of it's moralized, he describes it based on that as always appealing to the person in the worst position. And I was thinking, well, actually, I don't think that's true. And I mean, we almost came to a strike at my university. And I can say that one of the difficulties was, you know, the faculty discussion. There were people saying, we don't want to go on strike if it's about contract workers. Our interests diverged. I mean, they were in solidarity with each other, but I can't say they were in solidarity. I mean, we don't have contract workers even at our department meetings, right? So who are teaching. So I mean, I think there is solidarity, but yes, I think you would need to further deconstruct it. Yes, I mean, that's my intuition there. And on the idea of allyship, I mean, I'm going to take what you say. I mean, I'm just going to, I mean, agree with you about that example, that I could do a lot more with it and explain it. And I haven't, I think I do need, because I only have a presentation, I don't yet have a paper. I think I do need to explain all the axes of differentiation between what I take to be a solidaristic group, where there is some form of bonds that are, so I was saying that the bonds had to be created by shared history. So they don't always are created by oppression. They could be created by shared history. So they have bonds. They could meet the conditions, but then I think we might want to reject their claims. I mean, I think that's true.
Okay, so we've got our next question here, and then there was an online question, and then depending on time, we'll get to, I believe you had your hand up first, and then. Okay, okay.
Okay, so I'll try to be quick. So I have a comment and a question. The comment again is just putting pressure on the distinction between allyship and solidarity. And just to give, and I just wanted to bring up this example because so I'm from Eastern Europe, and when I think about solidarity, what I think about is Poland in 1980, like the movement Solidarność, where which is of course it fits the description in very many ways, but also an important moment in the history of that movement was precisely when the intelligentsia, people from universities, some of them managed to break through the blockade around Gdańsk, and they joined the movement. So were they allies? Were they become part of the movement by assuming solidarity or acting in solidary ways with them? And so just flagging that coming from a different context, I have difficulty registering the difference in that context, and I think that might be important to take into account. And the question is, why do we think that it is important? So, a kind of solidarity skeptic might say that, look, we have this concept and it has its own history, right? It has a lot to do with like, Christian socialism and the Catholic Church and all that. And it's this kind of common currency, but maybe there isn't anything that it picks out philosophically, right? So why do we think that it is an important and interesting and useful concept to try to specify instead of saying that, yeah, in fact, when we try to analyze it, it just breaks down into these other kinds of concepts. And even though it's nice on like, on slogans, it doesn't really mean anything. I mean, I don't think that, but I think that's a legitimate question that I'm wondering about. Thank you.
Okay, can I take that in reverse order or should I wait for, like, I can take that now, right? Yeah, take that now. Okay, so I'm going to take it in reverse order. I think this conceptual, the different concepts of solidarity will have different normative implications. So I wasn't actually doing any normative implications really, although it's a little bit implicit on on the different concepts. So what obligations, but there would be a question is, do you have an obligation as an individual to be in solidarity with other people? And under what conditions would you be under an obligation? So, I mean, so I think that the questions of solidarity do raise normative questions. And then it might be important to get us the best concept of solidarity because they would have different normative implications. So I guess that would be one way in which I think about it. And in the question of the relationship between solidarity and allyship, I mean, it is the idea, I take the central idea is that a group that has a shared history and struggle or some basis of shared oppression is the solidaristic group. But I don't think that other people might not enter that group, that group is a kind of, isn't always a kind of thickly bordered group like in a Modigliani painting, right? So you could be that individuals are accepted into the group or doing work with the group, that they're part of the social movement. They might have a different skill set, so they're happily accepted in a union, right? Or workers. So they might not have begun as workers, but they are in the group now and they're accepted as part of the group. So that's a different condition than a condition where you have a group, and the group, I think, might accept individual members in for various reasons, and they're part of that group, depending, and the extent to which that's possible might actually be an empirical question. It might be context dependent, and then that's different from whether there's two groups, and the two groups ally for various reasons, and you could say, well, they're in solidarity about some end. And there, I think what I wanted to say there was intuitively, I think that if that group wants to be an ally, the group who is the central motivating group has to accept them as an ally. I think that's sort of my thought there. So on your case of the Polish solidarity, I think they accepted them as part of that group, as part of a social movement in which that was what was forging the bonds, was participating in a social movement to affect change.
Okay, I think we'll move to the online question there now. I think Patty's been waiting a little while, so.
Good. And thanks, Margaret, and thanks for prioritizing me. Just because I can't ask my questions over dinner. Margaret, I really enjoyed that. I took pictures from home of many of your slides, and I just have a thought about another difference between allyship and solidarity, which has to do with the costs of collective action for the individuals who are involved. And so I feel like one sort of defining feature, you might say, of solidaristic groups is that the costs of collective action and the benefits of collective action are more or less the same, right? If a solidaristic group is going to engage in civil disobedience, the costs are sort of we're expected to be the same for all the participators, and the benefits are supposed to be the same, whereas it's not the case for allies. The costs will be quite different. So like if you're a male ally acting in solidarity with women in the Me Too movement, then the sort of the actions that you might take and the costs that you would bear as part of that action would be different. Or similarly, when men act in solidarity with women by refusing to participate in manels, right? The costs are actually quite so a man who refuses to do that actually has to give up something that's quite important to him, maybe to participate in a panel that is relevant, and to make space for a woman. So to speak on that panel, or a racialized individual to speak on the panel, or something like that, right? So I feel like I wonder what you think about that. There's the one way to distinguish between whether you're talking about some acting in allyship with or in solidarity with would be to look at the cost, the burdens, costs of the action that you're taking, and the sort of the expected benefits if you're successful in your action.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting, because talk about the people in a solidaristic relationship as sharing kind of equal burdens, right, as members of whatever the social group is. But you're quite, and so I think in that picture, so that's the kind of condition, and I think it raised the picture with me that the people outside the group actually are in a privileged position vis-a-vis. But I mean, you're right that that's not actually always the case. It just is. I guess what maybe the claim is that they have, the costs are different, right? To make the distinction, they wouldn't have to necessarily be lighter, less. So that's actually like helpful. So I will incorporate this thought.
So Margaret, I found this really interesting. And in the field in which I work, the word solidarity is used a lot. That is in the study of the welfare state, particularly its more robust redistributive forms, a sort of classic Scandinavian welfare state. And the term solidarity has been used to describe, in part, the movements which generated that political form, those institutional forms. In the first instance, the labor movements and allied coalitions worked to build it. But at a particular point, the welfare state became the people's house, to use the Swedish term. It became something for the population as a whole. And so when we talk about social solidarity in the welfare state world, or at least when I do, I'm talking about either attitudinal support for a redistributive welfare state for the population as a whole, or I'm talking using it to describe the institutional structure of the welfare state, the program structure of the welfare state, as a manifestation of social solidarity. So that's how I've been using it. So there's two ways of thinking about that. One, can your concept be stretched to the population as a whole? That's point one. Or two, am I misusing it? Have I been misusing it all of my life? And please be careful when you answer that question. But I would add a footnote. I once had a discussion where we were using the term in the way I've just described with a group of sociologists from Europe on one hand and the US on the other. And the US sociologists to a person rejected the use of solidarity in the way that Europeans seem to be very comfortable with. So it's quite possible that they were right and I'm wrong. So I think there's a question buried in there somewhere.
There's at least two difficult questions there. So I did actually think about the use of the term social solidarity. And since people use it, and I began by saying, look, I'm pretty serious about ordinary language definitions. I can't say that you're wrong. But I mean, so the way in which I think about that is, so what's happening there is, as I would redescribe it, is that we had, like, so if you think about class divided countries, or you think about the UK, which was two nations, and there they meant wealthy people, the rich and the poor, and it was really two nations. And so the whole social democratic project was to create one nation, and so to create bonds of social solidarity, because the original two nations had no social solidarity. They lived in different universes. They spoke to different people. So the social democratic project is just to create social solidarity. It's an aspirational project. Do I think we have it? But I'm not against that aspiration. But I mean, in the sense that it would be good not to have to live in completely different universes of the wealthy and the poor. So I think that's the origin of the idea of social solidarity. It's the idea that we could create a whole society that is bound together in relations of some form of equality. And it's an aspirational idea, actually one I believe in, but I don't think we evince empirical solidarity in our societies of that kind. And I think there is a social movement and a political program to create it. And I think we came closer at some point in time earlier, like since the 19th century, when we were really two worlds, we came closer, and then I think we're come further away.
But you would accept the use of the term to describe attitudes which are supportive of that kind of thing.
Well, to the extent that a movement that tries to, so I thought that it's a collective, so it's collective action trying to create so I think there is some collective action. It's mediated through institutions trying to create a social, some kind of social unity and identification. I think that's what we mean by social solidarity. Have we created it? Is there some kind of bonds between people in the whole society? That's what I take to be how it's used, and I take it that it's a pretty incomplete form as present. I know my colleague is not convinced. He's making faces at me, but that's okay. Not true.
It is 4:54 now, so I believe it is time to call for today. Dr. Pangos, is that?
Yes.
Okay.
You want this?
No, it's not. It's just about. So I know you've heard rumors about